Banished long ago as a knight, this soldier now returns as a fully fledged king, having traveled through land, sea, and time itself, from the lands between, amidst the sea of fog, and even the convoluted storms of Farum Azula. He has earned experience and a name. He is now back in the present, seeking his rightful title as Elden Lord. A tactical master and an arcanist at heart, he is capable of landing the most damaging strikes with pinpoint accuracy. Whatever his halberd does not reach, his dragon's breath will. All hail King Pierce. This is a Dexterity Arcane build that strives to give the player full control of the physical space of battle. We aim to combine a sturdy character with high defenses and the ability of producing damage through the bleed status effect and a few incantations that allows us to diversify damage types. This character excels at steady combat, controlling the time and space of the action. Sometimes it is better to dodge an attack, sometimes it is better to block it, but there are also times that all we have to do is take a step back to get the perfect punish. As always, we will review the stats of the build, the equipment that we use, and of course its applications within the game. Since there is a lot of ground to cover, I have created timestamps in the description of this video in order to make it easier to navigate the content and give you the opportunity to skip straight to the part that interests you the most. Let's get started. When I sat down to make a Dexterity Arcane build, I ran into the problem that there is very little variety in flavor. Most Dex Arcane weapons are bleed types like Rivers of Blood, Bloody Hellis, Morgoth's Curved Sword, etc. There is also the Regalia of Eocade that can run a pretty good blender build. This build can run all of these weapons. Every single Dex Arcane weapon can be used in this build at maximum efficiency. That being said, I wanted to bring this build type closer to my own personal playstyle. So we try to focus on having a very reliable character with high HP and defenses that can take advantage of a patience and reactive style to make sure that we dispose of enemies in the safest and most efficient way possible. Taking advantage of a halberd with a good range and a shield to run counterattacks, as well as some really good spacing, we are able to minimize the danger to us while maximizing the danger to our opponent. All of this is further enhanced with status effect support and incantation support. This build gives us access to defensive spells and also Dragon Communion spells, which provide us more survivability but also damage and a more diverse amount of status effects. To reach this objective, we will be running the following stats. Start the game as a Vagabond. This class is the most efficient to reach the required stat block for this build, allowing us to use every single rune level possible to its maximum potential. As the primary focus of this build is PvE, I have chosen to base it on rune level 150. Finally, this is the stats blocks that you want to end up with. 60 Vigor, 10 Mind, 19 Endurance, 16 Strength, 55 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 15 Faith, and 45 Arcane. There are many ways to level up these stats. You can do this however you feel comfortable. That being said, I do recommend that you take the following path. As soon as you are in the lands between, the first thing to do is get your Vigor to 20. Survivability is more important than damage when you're just starting out a character. The second priority will be to get Faith to 15 and Arcane to 12. This will give you access to defensive incantations that will make the playthrough much easier. Things like resistance spells and the Dragon Communion Incantations, as well as Blood Flame Blade, will all make running through the game much more simpler. The third priority will be to get Dexterity to 30. This is the main damage stat of the build. We need to get it up in order to meet weapon requirements and increase our damage scaling. The fourth priority is to get Vigor to 40. This will allow you to survive comfortably throughout the mid-game, letting you focus on your other stats. The fifth priority is to get Endurance to 19 and Strength to 16. This will increase our equip load, allowing us to use more protective armor, and the extra Strength will allow us to use some of the most common Dex Arcane weapons in the game. The sixth priority is to get Arcane to 45. This will max out our status effect application, primarily Bleed, and it will also increase our incantation scaling through the use of the Dragon Communion seal. The seventh priority is to top off Vigor at 60. This will put your hour require HP pool, granting you maximum security to withstand the hardest hitting attacks from the endgame enemies. The 8th and final priority is to bring Dexterity to 55. This will close out our build by maximizing the damage scaling that we get from the most common weapons that we will be using. So, why do we want these final stats? Allow me to explain. Vigor at 60 because I believe that it is the perfect amount of health to survive the hardest hitting attacks of PvE. This will give us a total of 1900 base HP. It is the second cap for the stat. Going any higher really diminishes your returns, and honestly, I never go any lower. Mind at 10 because it is the base level of the Vagabond. This level of Mind gives us enough FP in order to execute a full casting of the basic Dragon Breath Incantations. It also allows a few uses of our support incantations and the Ashes of War that we run in this build. It is enough, and we do not need to level it up any further. Endurance at 19 because it has been min-maxed in order to let the character use the weapons and armor that I prefer for this build. It is perfected at 69.13% equip load. If you put any less points, we lose the build. If you put any more points, you are wasting them. Strength at 16 because it is what we need in order to meet the weapon requirements of the most common Dex Arcane weapons in the game. Rivers of Blood, Bloody Hellis, Regalia of Aeocade, so on and so forth. Dexterity at 55 because it is one of the main stats of the build. It governs our weapon requirements and our damage. We leveled this up to the second soft cap in order to obtain the most efficient amount of benefit. Intelligence at 9 because it is the base level of the Vagabond. We do not need to level this up at all for this build. Faith at 15 because it is the level that we need in order to use some very basic but also very important support incantations that will increase our damage and our defenses, particularly speaking about the Dragon Communion Incantations. Finally, Arcane at 45 because it is the second primary stat of the build. It gives us additional damage, it maximizes our status effect application, and also increases the incantation scaling of our seal. Moving on to the equipment, this is the basic layout of the build. Like I mentioned before, I wanted to bring the Dex Arcane archetype into my own playstyle. That being said, this build is still capable of running all of the standard Dex Arcane weapons in the game. Rivers of Blood, Bloody Hellis, Eleanor's Poleblade, Regalia of Aeocade, Reduvia, Morgoth's Cursed Sword, all of the standard armaments that we know and love. Personally, I wanted to step away from these as I find them a bit boring, so here is what I propose. Starting with the armaments, our weapon of choice is the Banished Knight's Blood Halberd. The halberd type weapons are some of my favorite in the game as I find them to be extremely useful and versatile. In this case, the Banished Knight Halberd offers us a really good balance of reach and damage. We infuse the weapon down the blood path in order to generate additional damage through this status effect. Overall, this weapon provides us with good damage that is capable of outranging most enemies in the game. This additional range allows us to use proper spacing in order to make enemy attacks miss us without even dodging. As for the Ash of War, we will be using Repeating Thrust. I believe that this is the perfect Ash of War for this build due to two reasons. First, it is a multi-hitting technique that, paired with this halberd, allows us to combo enemies. Each hit applies the bleed status effect, and the result is that we are able to proc the bleed status with a single use of this Ash of War. The other reason is its movement. This technique moves our character forward as it attacks. Going back to the concept of spacing, this Ash of War allows us to dodge enemy attacks by simply stepping back and then countering immediately. The result is obvious. The Banished Knight's Halberd combines damage, reach, and spacing to give us a true weapon of battlefield control. Also in our main hand, I run a Pocket Misericord. This is a standard practice that I try to normalize for all of my builds. My playstyle benefits stance breaks because I do a lot of counterattacks and I do a lot of jump attacks. Since I see a lot of enemy stance breaks, I keep the Misericord handy in order to soft swap to it and get the maximum amount of critical damage. In this build, I infused my Misericord down the lightning path. This provides this build with the highest amount of critical damage possible. As for the Ash of War, I chose to run Thunderbolt. Kick is also a good choice, but I decided to stick with Thunderbolt because it gives me a ranged option to take care of enemies that may be out of my reach. Having a mid-range option that also covers differences in elevation is very important to this build. This is a back pocket option, and that means that it only comes out when needed. That being said, it is very good at what it does, and I would hate to be caught without it. In the offhand, I run the Banished Knight Shield. There is no specific reason for running this shield besides the way it looks. It fits the fashion, so I went with it. That said, it does provide a very good amount of guard boost for a medium shield of its weight. It is second to the brass shield only, and that is only by 1 point of guard boost. In other words, it is a negligible difference. As for its Ash of War, I chose no skill. I'd rather have the skill of my halberd more easily accessible. Other than this, you can run any other shield that you prefer based on the looks, as long as it does not put you into a heavy load. So, pick what you like. Also in the offhand, I run an Incantation Seal to help me cast my support spells. In this case, I like to run the Dragon Communion Seal. This seal is objectively the best one for this build because it has the highest incantation scaling for the stats that we run. Also, it has an innate damage boost for the Dragon Communion Incantations that we like to use. Specifically, it is a 15% damage bonus. Furthermore, it weighs 0.0 units, meaning that it does not increase our equip burden. It is all benefits using this seal, so there is no reason to pick any other. Having access to some defense incantations for survival and the Dragon Communion Incantations for crowd control damage give this build some further control options. There should not be a situation that we cannot handle. With our weapons out of the way, let's talk about Talismans. This build has one objective when it comes to Talismans: being able to survive. This means that we want to have a lot of HP as well as high defenses and negation in order to survive some hits. In the same way, we want to be able to optimize our equip burden to allow us the use of multiple equipment options. For this reason, we are running the Earth Tree Favor +2 and the Crimson Amber Medallion +2 in order to get the HP values that we want. The Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for increased damage negation, and the Great Jar's Arsenal in order to increase our equip load capability. With this setup, we will have a total of 2134 HP with a total of 45% physical damage negation. We are able to do this in part thanks to the extra equip load that we get from the Great Jar's Arsenal Talisman. In this way, we can get a character that is very tanky, but also provides a good amount of damage through status effect and incantation combinations. Alright, let's talk about armor. In this game, armor is extremely important. This is because this game has extremely good looking armor. Fashion Souls, or Elden Bling, however you prefer to call it, is at an all-time high. For this build, I wanted to make a king, and that meant that I had to use the Elden Lord crown. After that, I used the Banished Knight armor, the Banished Knight gauntlet, and Bligh's greaves. Now, since FromSoft decided to give us Godfrey's hair with the crown for some weird reason, you're going to have to play around with the color of the character's beards in order to make it match. Otherwise, you can just shave your character. For now, do your best, but I hope that we can just alter the hair away at some point. It's just in the way. Overall, this setup gives us a total of 31% physical damage negation, which we can turn into the already mentioned 45% physical damage negation with the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. It also provides us with 63 poise, which is a very good amount for PvE play. This build is a good example of being able to combine a good looking fashion with some really good stats. This fashion is reliable and it can be applied to many different types of builds. I enjoy it a lot. When it comes to the spirit summon that we will use for this build, I decided that the best choice is the Mimic. First of all, it is my favorite summon in the game, and that alone makes me use it in almost every single build that I make. That said, it does come with some very good strategic advantages. The first thing that I will tell you is to always have your halberd and your incantation seal out, before you summon the Mimic. I will repeat this so it is clear. Before you summon the Mimic, have your halberd on your right hand and the Dragon Communion seal on the left. Not the shield, the seal. The Mimic spawns with the equipment that you have present on your character at the time of summoning, and we are interested in our Mimic having access to the halberd for melee range and bleed procs, as well as the seal for spellcasting destruction. In this way, you will have access to a second copy of the build that is capable of fighting right next to you in melee, or provide support from the back with the different Dragon Communion Incantations. You can take enemy aggro and proc bleed while the Mimic is behind you showering enemies with Dragon Ice or Rotten Breath, or you can share aggro with the Mimic while you both harass the enemy with bleed proccing halberd pokes. It is true that we cannot control what the Mimic does, but we can make it so that no matter what it does choose to do, it is always helpful to the build. The final note on this summon is the fact that it will also use the items you have equipped in your tool belt. I always keep sleep pots and freezing pots so that the enemy can constantly hurl these at enemies. It doesn't cost us resources and it provides additional crowd control and status effect superiority. I love the Mimic because no matter what the situation, it always does something useful. As mentioned earlier in the video, there is a series of incantations that I like to use to give this character an edge in every single battle. Some of these incantations provide us a defensive advantage, others increase our resource management, and there are a few that increase our offensive power in key situations. I use every single memory slot with this character, and every incantation shines as an answer to a specific problem. The list is what you see on the screen. Dragon Fire, Dragon Ice, Rotten Breath, Swarm of Flies, Heal, Flame Cleanse Me, Magic Fortification, Flame Fortification, Lightning Fortification, and Divine Fortification. The first incantations on the list are Dragon Fire, Dragon Ice, and Rotten Breath. These three are very important and I group them together because they serve a similar purpose. In fact, they have two main jobs: crowd control and status effect domination. First of all, they are great AoE attacks that allow us to eliminate or heavily injure groups of enemies before they become a problem. Dragon Fire is specifically useful in this situation against enemies that are staggered by fire type damage. Enemies like dogs or the huge Miranda plants will begin to writhe in pain when attacked with this damage type. This opens up the opportunity for further carnage. Second, in the cases of Dragon Ice and Rotten Breath, they allow us to proc Frostbite and Scarlet Rot on our targets very easily. Frostbite deals a set amount of damage to the target and most importantly, inflicts a debuff that lowers their damage negation by 20%. And then, of course, Scarlet Rot is an extremely potent damage over time debuff that increases DPS on any boss fight that it is used. Overall, all three are very important parts of the incantation list due to the fact that they cover for the build's weaknesses. Furthermore, at our current mine level, we are guaranteed a full cast of these incantations with a single FP bar. Swarm of Flies is a prime tactical choice for our list of incantations. The damage that this spell does is absolutely useless. That being said, we do not care about its damage. This spell has two objectives. It is there to inflict bleed, and it is there to pull enemies towards us. I mentioned earlier in the video that this build is about controlling space and that it was very good at one-on-one battles. This obviously means that fighting groups of high priority targets proves to be a bit more difficult. Swarm of Flies allows us to target a single enemy before battle and pull it away from the others in order to allow us to take them down one at a time. This kind of manipulation is extremely important in order to always have the advantage in every fight. Furthermore, the addition of the bleed procs makes it so that enemies are already weakened by the time they reach us. Overall, this is not an incantation that will provide us with huge damage numbers. That being said, it proves to be a fantastic choice for top-tier strategic utility. Heal is the only healing spell that I use. That being said, its purpose is not exactly to heal myself. In fact, I use this spell for one thing and one thing only: to kill revenants. Revenants are one of the most powerful and annoying non-boss type enemies that you can find in the game. They deal an incredible amount of damage and are in constant motion and attack. They teleport around the area and, I am sure you know, have that one move where they hit you 1,000,000 times with all of their limbs in succession. It is very difficult to fight them, but fortunately, if you do not let them get started on their offense, then they become much easier to defeat. In order to achieve this, we use heal. Revenants are very weak to holy damage, but also they are extremely weak to healing spells. If you cast a healing spell with an AoE and it catches the Revenant, they will take damage instead of being healed. The amount of damage they take is always the same: 50% of their max HP plus an additional 300 damage. 2 spells will always kill them, and since the first spell also staggers them, it is very easy to cast 2 of them back to back for the kill. Since the damage is always the same, I like to use heal because it costs the least amount of FP of all of the AoE heals. If you execute this strategy correctly, then you will be able to defeat the Revenant before it has a chance to hit you. Flame Cleanse Me is one of the most powerful incantations in the game. It provides a fast, cheap way to get rid of poison and, most importantly, Scarlet Rot. This should always be in your list of spells. Scarlet Rot is extremely annoying, and so is poison. It is especially harmful in Elden Ring because due to the size of the game and all of the exploring that we do, having a damage over time debuff like poison or Scarlet Rot is really bad for your resource management. Furthermore, it is good to note that this incantation deals a very minuscule amount of fire damage to you when you cast it. The damage itself is insignificant, but it is still fire type damage. This means that we can use this incantation to remove the effect of Frostbite, another dangerous status effect. As a result, Flame Cleanse Me becomes an indispensable tool to improve our comfort during exploration. The quartet of Magic Fortification, Flame Fortification, Lightning Fortification, and Divine Fortification is what I like to call the Resistance Crew. This is our main tool to counterpick the damage that each of the game's enemies and bosses will do. They provide resistances to magic, fire, lightning, and holy damage respectively. You should always have one of these active if you want to increase your chances of survival. They are cheap to cast, costing very little FP, and they last a considerable amount of time, taking into consideration how much of a defensive boost they represent. Each of these incantations will leave you with around 50% damage negation against the chosen damage type, depending on what kind of armor you choose to use. Mileage may vary, but it is always a good choice to have these on if you know that the enemy or boss deals some kind of elemental damage. In this case, the more we know, the stronger we can get. If you play fighting games in any serious capacity, then I am sure that you will be familiar with the concept of space control. It is, after all, one of the pillars of footsies. These same principles can be applied to Elden Ring, especially when it comes to those high-priority enemies that have more HP and more mobility. Being able to control the different possibilities in these battles can become very important in order to defeat these enemies with minimal resource investment. While this build and character can take full advantage of these spacing tools due to the use of the halberd, they can really be applied by any character and all build types. These are general battle techniques that will help you become better at taking care of some of the most troublesome enemies in the game. I want to cover 3 of them specifically: reaction, provocation, and doing nothing. If you find yourself fighting an aggressive enemy, then the worst thing that can happen is to be overwhelmed. In this case, we have the expectation that the opponent will always be attacking, and as such, you can be ready for these attacks. If you have good knowledge of the enemy moveset, or if you are good at observing distances and ranges, then you can aim to avoid these attacks by simply stepping back, or to the side. This allows you to obtain maximum time for maximum punishment. This is a reactionary technique that has you adapt to your opponent's movement. Since the opponent will always be doing something, it is very easy to be ready for it. The advantages of this technique is that you can have an answer for almost anything that the enemy does, and sure enough, the damage that each punish inflicts upon the enemy will very quickly add up. If you're able to react correctly, then the battle will be over in a matter of seconds. Now, let's talk about the other end of the spectrum. There are some enemies that are naturally passive and wait for the player to make a move. They are usually enemies with shields or some sort of protective stance. The key in this case is that NPC enemies generally pose no threat when they are in their defensive stance. As a result, we are able to plan a safe attack that lowers our risk of failure. The number one tool for this case is our reach. The halberd allows us to provoke enemies with simple pokes. This should generate a reaction. Since we know that this reaction will come, we can be ready for it and punish it appropriately. It is a mistake to become overly aggressive when there is a passive enemy. The best course of action is to observe, provoke, and punish. This guarantees that our attack is safe and that we are ready to punish the reaction with a stronger offensive. That said, what if the enemy does not react? Well, in that case, we provoke again. If there is no answer from the enemy to your provocation, then we just got free damage. There is no reason to overextend and put ourselves in danger. Provoke until the reaction comes. Remember that these are NPC enemies. They will react, and you will be ready. Sometimes we face opponents that are not overly aggressive, but they are also not in an obvious defensive stance. They are difficult to react to because they are not easy to read. Sometimes these same opponents are hard to provoke. It is not safe to do so because they have more reach than us, because they are faster than us, or because they have more poise than us. These are dangerous enemies, and in this case, the best thing to do is to do nothing. It may sound weird because we are in fact doing a lot, but it definitely looks like we are doing nothing. In reality, we are maintaining a certain distance from the enemy, which allows us to remove their options and make it so that there are less possible outcomes. We stand at certain ranges where the enemy AI chooses to not do certain attacks and only focuses on a few other moves. In this way, by limiting the possible responses from the enemy, we have to juggle less outcomes, and that increases our readiness for them. Our provocation comes from a simple dance that we do at a very specific distance, trying to bait the enemy into an attack. Then, of course, comes our reaction to punish it. But before any of this can happen, we have to understand that the best thing we can do in these situations is absolutely nothing, because there is actually a lot happening when we do nothing. If there's one thing that I enjoy about this build, is the fact that it is very simple to use, but at the same time, extremely effective. It has really good melee potential that combines the benefits of a halberd with the safety of a shield, but it also gives us the right amount of incantation support, both offensive and defensive, to cover any potential weaknesses that the build can have. It is extremely reliable and a good candidate to take on any content that the game can offer. Normally, Dex Arcane revolves too much around the same weapons, and I honestly do not enjoy using those. That said, this build supports them all so that those players that do like them have the chance to make good use of them. This is just another testament to the build's value. While this is definitely not my favorite type of build, I have grown to like it a lot throughout the time that I used it to make this guide. I am very confident that it will not let you down. Thank you very much for your time, and I do hope that I get to see you on the next one.